They fined him 1-0 for parking his boat on his own lake. An old black man they thought couldn't fight back. But he owned everything. And he was done being quiet. What happens when the man they tried to erase owns the land beneath their feet? Welcome to my channel. If you love insane HOA revenge stories, hit that subscribe button because this one is wild. I had just finished unloading the last of my tools when I first met her, Sandra Whitmore, president of the Millstone Shores HOA. She stood at the edge of my gravel driveway, arms crossed, pearls tight around her neck like a leash of superiority. Her eyes scanned me slowly, faded denim, flannel sleeves rolled up, dark skin weathered by sun and years. I could see it in her face. I didn't fit the brochure. Didn't introduce herself. Instead, she nodded toward the dock my father built with his own hands in 1961 and said coldly, "That dock doesn't belong to you." I paused, wiping sweat from my brow. "Ma'am, it's been right there since before you were born." She gave a thin smile, not in the eyes of the HOA. And just like that, I knew exactly what kind of welcome I was getting. 3 days after Sandra's cold greeting, effective immediately, it read, "You are fined 1-0 for unlawful mooring of a private vessel on HOA waters. Failure to remove said vessel within 48 hours will result in towing and escalation to civil court." At the bottom, in bold, "No individual may occupy or utilize HOA lake property for personal purposes." I stared at those words for a long moment. Then I walked to the old pine desk in my study, opened the bottom drawer where I kept my father's war medals, land deeds, and quietly slid the letter in beside them. And I smiled. On Thursday evening, just after the sun had dipped behind the ridge, I had stepped out to take the trash to the roadside, letting the crickets fill the quiet as I walked barefoot down the gravel path. That's when I heard them two voices, low but clear, drifting from the sidewalk just past my property line. I knew that tone. The kind people use when they think you're too far away to hear or too insignificant to matter if you do. "We'll have to get it cleared out before mid-July," Sandra said. Her heels clicked sharply on the pavement between sentences, like punctuation for her displeasure. "The pier's going right there. That dock is in the way of everything." Marcus Reed grunted. I recognized him by the cough deep and habitual from too many cigars. "We can't just bulldoze it. It's still technically on his lot." Sandra scoffed, voice thick with disdain. "Technically, but he's already in violation. Once the fines pile up, he'll fold. They always do." They paused a moment near my mailbox. I stepped behind the shadow of my oak tree, not out of fear, just strategy. Sandra continued, her voice colder now. "The fishing festival is the face of this neighborhood, Marcus. It brings in money, press, sponsors. We can't have a rotting dock and some old man in flannel ruining the aesthetic. That boat of his? It's a stain on the lake." Marcus chuckled, low and cruel. "Besides, it's not like he even knows what he's sitting on. Probably doesn't even understand the bylaws. I doubt he can tell a land deed from a grocery list." They walked off after that, their laughter fading into the dark like bad perfume. I stood there for a while, hands in my pockets, breathing slow. Not angry, not surprised, just certain. Certain that this had never been about regulations or safety. It wasn't about architectural codes or community standards. This was personal. They didn't like that I was here, that a man who looked like me had dared to return, to inherit, to hold his ground. To them, I wasn't a neighbor. I was an inconvenience. An obstacle in the way of their plans and photo ops. And worse yet, I was invisible until I wasn't. But what they didn't know, what Sandra and Marcus hadn't bothered to ask, was that I'd been raised by a man who built with his own hands and kept every document in a fireproof box behind the old oak dresser. They didn't know that my father had taught me to read every line of a contract before signing anything, to understand the laws that govern land and water, and to never underestimate the power of patience. That night, I sat at the edge of the dock with my thermos of tea, letting the lake's silence work its way through me. I began to plan. The next morning, I made coffee stronger than usual and walked into the back room. It had once been my father's workshop. Now, It was where I kept everything that mattered. An old filing cabinet, 2 wooden chests, and a heavy desk made from repurposed barn wood. I unlocked the bottom drawer of the cabinet. It creaked in protest, like an old man roused from sleep. Inside, beneath yellowed manila folders and newspaper clippings, was what I had been looking for. A thick leather, bound portfolio wrapped in waxed cloth. My father had labeled it with a simple brass plate, Millstone Lake 1960, 1, personal use, ownership records. I brought it to the table, unwrapped the cloth, and began flipping through the contents. My father had documented everything: land surveys, correspondence with the county, receipts from when he purchased the tract before the HOA even existed. There was even a notarized letter from the Department of Natural Resources granting him riparian rights over the lake and a 20-foot buffer along the shore, including the very spot where my dock now stood. There it was, in black and white. I didn't just inherit a house, I inherited the lake itself. I leaned back in the chair and let the weight of that truth settle in. Not just symbolic ownership, not just family nostalgia, legal, binding, state-recognized ownership. They wanted to treat me like a squatter on their curated little lake, but I wasn't squatting, I was home. Still, I needed more than dusty documents. I needed a second opinion, someone who could turn this paper trail into an iron wall, so I called Camille Brown. Camille had been my father's attorney for years, a sharp black woman in her late 60s. She had a voice like gravel and a mind like steel. She picked up on the first ring. "Jeremiah Cole," she said. "Haven't heard that name since your daddy's funeral. I figured you were off building bridges in Houston." "Now I'm building something quieter," I replied. "But I've run into a noise called the HOA." She chuckled. "Say no more. Bring everything you've got." 2 hours later, I was sitting in her office. Camille wore a navy suit with gold cufflinks and had reading glasses perched at the end of her nose. As she examined the documents, she hummed in agreement, flipping pages with expert precision. "Jeremiah," she said, looking up at last, "your father was meticulous. These records are solid. You own this lake and its access points. The HOA has no jurisdiction over your dock. None. If they try to enforce removal or fine you for usage, they're acting outside the scope of their authority." I nodded. "They already fined me $1,000. Her eyebrows arched. "Good. That makes this even better. They've documented their overreach." She drafted a formal response on the spot. In language clean and sharp, she addressed the Millstone Shores HOA. "Mr. Jeremiah Cole is the legal owner of the land, shoreline, and water access as established in 1961 and reaffirmed through the Department of Natural Resources. Any attempt to enforce removal, restrict access, or levy fines is a violation of state property law and may be subject to legal action." But we didn't stop there. "Camille," I said slowly, "what if they're misusing HOA funds? That fishing festival, it's funded by dues, right?" Her eyes narrowed. "You're suggesting financial mismanagement." "I'm suggesting a pattern of intimidation disguised as tradition," I replied, "and someone should look into that." She pulled out a second sheet of paper and began drafting a formal complaint to the County Oversight Committee, requesting a preliminary investigation into how HOA funds were being allocated specifically toward private projects like the proposed fishing pier, which, by all accounts, was being constructed without proper permit or environmental clearance. By sundown, both letters were signed, sealed, and on their way. That night, I returned to my dock. The wind was soft. And for the first time in days, I didn't feel like I was defending something. By Saturday morning, the lakeside was a circus of canopies and caution tape. Volunteers from the HOA bustled around setting up food booths, folding chairs, and branded banners. Children chased each other between tents while a local bluegrass band tuned their instruments on the temporary stage near the shoreline. It was the grand opening day of the Millstone Shores annual fishing festival, or so they thought. Sandra Whitmore was in her element, clipboard clutched tight in manicured hands, lips painted crimson like she was preparing for a press conference. "She's glowing," I heard one resident whisper. I guess that dock business never amounted to much. That was the plan, after all. They thought I wouldn't push back, that a fine and a few passive-aggressive letters would send me packing. But that morning, they were about to find out the cost of underestimating an old man with patience and paperwork. At exactly 10:00 a.m., I walked down from my cabin wearing my Sunday shirt and carrying two things: a rolled-up deed in my left hand and a steel post in my right. I reached the lakeside just as the opening announcements began. Sandra spotted me from across the crowd and tilted her head slightly, not quite a greeting, more like a challenge. I didn't return it. Instead, I stepped calmly to the edge of the dock they had constructed and drove the steel post into the earth with a single, practiced motion. I unrolled a white sign and affixed it to the post. Its message was simple. Private waters. Entry prohibited without consent. Trespassers will be prosecuted. Gasps rippled through the crowd. A few children stopped mid-step. Some of the older residents exchanged worried glances. Then came the sirens. 2 county police cruisers arrived, followed by a vehicle from the Department of Natural Resources. Out stepped Rachel Morgan, the same environmental officer who'd reviewed my reports. She approached with a file folder in hand and a calm authority that silenced even Sandra. This shoreline and adjacent lakewaters fall under private ownership, Rachel announced clearly, holding up the deed I had submitted. This event does not have legal authorization to take place on this land. Sandra stepped forward, trying to recover her confidence. This is a community tradition. We've held this festival for years. And for years, you've unknowingly held it on land that doesn't belong to the HOA, Rachel interrupted. Sandra's mouth opened, then closed. Her clipboard dropped slightly. A deputy stepped forward and said what everyone was already thinking: the festival is over. Disperse immediately. Vendors began packing. Families gathered their things. The music stopped mid-tune. All the noise, the laughter, the chaos vanished. And Sandra? She stood frozen, her face drained of color, her posture wilted. The woman who had once told me my dock didn't belong had now lost her dock, her event, and her pride, all in one morning. I didn't speak a word to her. The sign I had planted said everything. They didn't wait long to retaliate. Within a week of the festival's cancellation, a courier showed up at my front porch with a thick envelope bearing the HOA's lawyer's letterhead. Inside was a formal lawsuit, Cole v. Free, Millstone Shores HOA. They were accusing me of defamation, obstruction of community events, and willful disruption of HOA operations. At the center of it all, the 1-0 fine and my refusal to comply. I chuckled. Then I called Camille. She wasn't surprised. It's what they do when power slips through their fingers, she said. They think courtrooms will scare people into silence. But I wasn't afraid, not of courtrooms, and not of Sandra Whitmore. We filed a countersuit within 48 hours, backed by the original property deeds, riparian ownership documents from 1961, and a full report from the Department of Natural Resources confirming that Millstone Lake and its adjoining access points were not under HOA jurisdiction. Included were satellite maps, surveyed boundaries, and Rachel Morgan's environmental impact assessment. Camille even added a sworn statement from the state inspector declaring that any attempt to build structures near the spawning zones had been in direct violation of environmental protection laws. The courtroom was full on the day of the hearing. Residents who had once been neutral were now curious, even sympathetic. Some had begun to wonder what else the HOA had gotten wrong. Sandra arrived in a sleek black suit, her face drawn tight and unreadable. She was flanked by 2 attorneys from a city firm known more for intimidating small businesses than defending neighborhoods. But intimidation doesn't work when the truth is too heavy to move. As the judge sifted through the evidence, I could feel the room shifting. Camille presented our case with the calm of someone who had studied every line, cross-checked every citation, and smelled fear before it entered the room. Then came the moment Sandra hadn't prepared for. Camille pulled out the letter. The one with the HOA's official seal and Sandra's signature at the bottom. The 1-0 fine. This letter, Camille said, holding it up for the judge, was issued under the claim that Mr. Cole was illegally occupying HOA property. However, the lake in question is not owned, leased, or governed by the Millstone Shores HOA. It is private property, deeded to the Cole family since 1961, predating the HOA's establishment by nearly 3 decades. The courtroom went quiet. Sandra's lead attorney objected, citing procedural technicalities. The judge overruled him. She turned to Sandra. "Did you verify the ownership of the lake before authorizing this fine?" Sandra hesitated. "We operated on the assumption that." "No," the judge said flatly. "That's not how governance works." In her final ruling, Judge Whitaker declared the fine unenforceable, baseless, and retaliatory, and further stated that the HOA had acted beyond its authority in a manner that risked civil liability and violated state-level property protections. The court ordered the HOA to rescind the 1-0 fine, issue a formal written apology to Mr. Cole, pay for all legal fees associated with the defense. Sandra stood there as the ruling was read, her arms folded tightly across her chest, jaw clenched hard enough to crack her pearls. I didn't gloat, but I looked her in the eye as we passed outside the courtroom. And for the first time since I returned to Millstone Lake, she didn't say a word. By the following week, the headlines were everywhere. Elderly black veteran wins landmark case against HOA. Lake ownership dispute exposes years of overreach by Millstone Shores Board. 1-0 fine issued on private property sparks HOA reform. It wasn't just the local newspaper anymore. Regional radio stations, community blogs, even an environmental justice group based in Atlanta picked up the story. And with every new article, every reposted link, the tone shifted from curious to outraged. People were asking the right questions. How did an HOA try to fine someone for using land they didn't own? Why did no one stop them sooner? And most important of all, how many other families had been silenced in similar ways? Within days, emails began pouring into Camille's office, some from lawyers, some from journalists, and many from former and current residents of Millstone Shores. One message stood out. It came from a woman named Lorraine James, who had lived in the neighborhood a decade earlier. "They made my father tear down a shed he built with his own hands," she wrote. "Said it didn't fit the aesthetic of the block, but our white neighbors had similar ones, and no one said a thing." Another came from a young couple who'd only stayed a year. "We were told our urban decor was scaring off buyers. They fined us for having a Black Lives Matter flag." Each story echoed the same rhythm: soft-spoken intimidation dressed up as policy, selective enforcement, and a quiet exit by those who didn't have the time, money, or knowledge to fight back. But now, someone had. And his name was Jeremiah Cole. The town hall that month was the most crowded I'd ever seen it. Folding chairs ran out within minutes. People stood along the walls, sat on windowsills, even listened from the hallway. The board sat stiffly at their table, lips thin, eyes darting. Sandra wasn't among them. She had officially stepped down just 2 days earlier. Resignation letter short, cold, and unsigned. 3 more members followed in her wake, citing a need for personal reflection and changing priorities. But everyone in that room knew the truth. The mask had slipped, and no one wanted to be caught holding it. When I was called to speak, the room fell silent. I didn't prepare a speech. I didn't need to. I walked to the center, placed my hand on the same wooden podium Sandra had once stood behind, and let my eyes meet theirs, not with anger, not with pride, but with a calm that comes from knowing who you are. "I've been told," I began, "that this was a win, that I beat them." A few heads nodded, others waited. But I didn't come back here to win anything. I came home, to a lake my father fished, to land he paid for with sweat and stubborn hope. And I stayed quiet at first, not out of fear but out of respect. I thought maybe the world had changed. I paused, letting the words settle. And then I got fined for using what was mine, not because I broke a law, but because someone assumed I didn't belong. There was a hush, thick and heavy, broken only by a quiet exhale somewhere in the back. I didn't retaliate, I continued. I didn't shout. I didn't vandalize. I read. I remembered. I researched. I showed them the same paper they would have believed without question had it come from someone who looked a little different. A few people lowered their heads. I'm not here to punish anyone. I'm here to remind you what fairness looks like, what dignity sounds like, and what happens when you stop assuming the worst about someone because they wear boots instead of loafers. There were no cheers, no applause. Just silence, real, thoughtful silence. And to me, that was better. Outside the town hall, a reporter stopped me. Young kid, early 20s, eyes bright. Mr. Cole, do you have a final message for others who might be going through the same thing? I thought for a moment. Then I smiled. Tell them, I said. I didn't fight back to prove them wrong. I fought to prove that we all have the right to be here, even when they pretend we don't. He nodded slowly, notebook trembling just slightly in his hands. And as I walked back to my truck, the same one my father used to tow our old fishing boat, I looked out across the lake. It was calm. But not quite. The water carried a new weight now. The weight of truth. And it was finally being heard. It started with one simple sign. I carved it by hand, just like my father used to carve the initials of his friends into the bench by the dock. I stained it with linseed oil, let it dry under the porch for a week, then bolted it to a post by the edge of the shoreline, right where the HOA's banner had once flapped in the wind. It read, "Respect the water, respect each other." That was it. No threats, no legalese, just a reminder, a message, an invitation. I didn't make an announcement, didn't send flyers, didn't post to any neighborhood forum, I just let the lake speak for itself. And slowly, they came. At first, it was Victor Ramirez, the retired Army vet, who lived 3 houses down, and had watched the whole ordeal with quiet sympathy. He showed up one morning with a folding chair, a thermos of black coffee, and a tackle box that looked older than my boots. Thought I'd get a line in before the summer heat comes, he said, not asking permission, just smiling. Glad to have the company, I replied. Then came the Wynn family, new to the neighborhood, hardly spoke during HOA meetings. Their son, Ben, asked if he could sit near the edge of the dock and sketch the herons. I handed him my spare life vest and said, "As long as you draw me catching a big one." By the end of that week, the dock had become something else, something no HOA could claim. Children dangled their feet over the water. Grandparents told stories about rivers back home in Georgia, in Ghana, in Guatemala. A single mother named Eliza taught her daughter to tie fishing knots while 2 teenage boys translated for their grandfather in Spanish. Nobody asked what anyone paid in dues. Nobody asked who belonged. They just passed the bait box, poured extra lemonade, and laughed when someone reeled in a shoe. And me? I just watched. Watched the dock fill with stories that didn't need HOA approval to exist. Watched the same water my father once stood beside carry echoes of everything good that survived the ugliness. One afternoon, a little girl no more than 6 years old approached me shyly. Her hair was tied with pink ribbon, and she held up a drawing, the lake, the dock, a handful of stick figures sitting side by side. "This is your house, right?" she asked. I looked at it, the big smile she'd drawn on my face, the curly white beard, the label that read, "Mr. J's Dock." I nodded. "It is." She looked back at the people on the dock. "But it's kind of everyone's now, isn't it?" I didn't hesitate. "Exactly," I said. That evening, I sat on the dock alone for the first time in weeks. The sun was sinking low, washing the lake in gold. I pulled out my old rod, tied a fresh lure, and cast into the water with a flick my father taught me when I was 10. As the ripples stretched outward, I thought about everything we'd been through, the threats, the lawsuits, the stares, but I also thought about what came after, the people, the laughter, the stillness between words. Justice doesn't always come with a gavel or a camera. Sometimes it comes as peace. Real peace, the kind that sits on your shoulder like a warm breeze and whispers, "You did right." Behind me, someone started humming, a song I didn't know, maybe gospel, maybe something older. Voices joined in, soft, scattered, imperfect. But together, they sounded whole. And I smiled, knowing somewhere deep in this old wood and still water, my father was smiling too.